I came home from my honeymoon expecting memories to last forever, only to find the HOA had built a massive wall across my own land. They thought they had won, until I built one that sealed every single HOA driveway. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. People always say the worst surprises happen when you're away. They never tell you that sometimes you come home married and discover someone else has claimed part of your future. The first thing I noticed wasn't the wall. It was the smell. Fresh concrete carries a sharp, chalky scent that hangs in warm air long after the mixers leave. That smell drifted across my property before I even finished turning off the engine. My wife, Emily, reached for my hand as we pulled into the gravel driveway, still laughing about our honeymoon in Montana, where the only walls we'd seen were snow-covered cliffs and pine forests stretching forever. Then I heard the grinding scream of a concrete saw somewhere beyond the oak trees my grandfather planted decades ago. The sound scraped across the quiet morning like metal against bone. My smile disappeared before I even opened the truck door. I climbed out and felt the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots. But something looked wrong. The eastern side of my property seemed smaller. For a moment, I actually questioned my own memory. Then I rounded the barn, and my stomach dropped so fast it felt like the ground vanished beneath me. A solid concrete wall stood across my land, nearly 9 feet tall. Fresh gray panels stretched farther than I could see, casting long shadows over the pasture where I used to help my grandfather repair fences every summer. Yellow construction equipment sat idling nearby, while workers packed up their tools as if they'd just finished another routine project. One of them glanced at me, shrugged, and climbed into his truck without saying a word. Emily whispered, "Ethan, wasn't that field yours?" I couldn't answer. My throat had gone dry. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 36 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and every acre standing in front of me had belonged to my family long before the subdivision behind that wall ever existed. My grandfather bought this land with money he earned repairing bridges after the Korean War. My father taught me to read property markers before he taught me how to drive. Every fence line, every oak tree, every weathered survey pin carried a story. I knew this property the way some people know the faces of their own children, which is exactly why I knew that wall didn't belong there. I walked toward it, running my fingers across the rough concrete. It was still damp enough to leave pale dust on my skin. Fresh construction, less than 2 days old, maybe less than 1. Then I noticed something that made everything even worse. Beyond the wall, inside Willow Creek Estates, brand new decorative signs pointed directly toward an opening built through my land. Residents were already driving through it as though it had existed forever. SUVs rolled past without slowing down. A golf cart crossed the opening carrying 2 smiling HOA volunteers wearing matching polo shirts. One of them waved at me like I was another neighbor enjoying the new improvement. That's when a white luxury SUV eased toward the entrance and stopped beside me. The driver's window lowered with deliberate confidence. Diane Whitlock, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, smiled as though she were welcoming me home. "Oh good," she said sweetly. "You're finally back. I was beginning to think you'd enjoy the honeymoon so much you'd never notice our little community upgrade." Diane stepped out of her SUV with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who's never been told no often enough. Her white linen blazer looked untouched by the construction dust swirling through the morning breeze, and oversized sunglasses hid her eyes until she slowly pulled them down and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who believed the game had already been won. "I was going to leave you a welcome home basket," she said, "but I figured you'd appreciate improved property values even more." Behind her, 2 HOA board members stood near a golf cart pretending to inspect landscaping while openly watching every reaction on my face. One of them chuckled under his breath. The other lifted a phone just high enough to record me. Emily squeezed my arm, silently asking me not to lose my temper. I took a slow breath. The scent of wet concrete mixed with fresh-cut grass and diesel exhaust burned the back of my throat. Every instinct told me to start shouting. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. Who gave you permission to build on my land? Diane folded her arms. Community necessity. I didn't ask for a slogan. She tilted her head slightly. The board voted unanimously. This access road benefits nearly 200 homeowners. Sometimes personal interests have to make room for community progress. I stared at her, wondering whether she actually believed the words coming out of her mouth. This isn't community property. She gave an almost sympathetic laugh. It is now, functionally speaking. Functionally speaking. The phrase echoed inside my head like an insult. Emily looked from the wall to Diane. You built this while we were gone. The timing simply worked out. She didn't even try to deny it. Every contractor's pickup was already leaving, their tires crunching across gravel that had belonged to my family longer than Willow Creek Estates had existed. They were gone before I could even ask who hired them. I walked farther down the wall, searching for the old survey monument near the eastern fence line. My grandfather had shown it to me when I was 12 years old. Never ignore these pins, he told me while brushing dirt away with his work gloves. People forget promises. Steel doesn't. The rusted marker was still there, half buried, half surrounded by fresh concrete. Someone had literally poured a wall around an official survey monument. I crouched beside it, brushing loose gravel away with my fingers. Emily whispered, "Is that important?" I nodded without taking my eyes off it. It tells me exactly where my property starts. And they're standing 6 feet inside it. For the first time that morning, I felt something other than anger. Certainty. I stood and continued following the wall until I reached its northern end. That's when I finally understood what Diane had really built. This wasn't just a wall. It was the entrance to an entirely new traffic system. For separate neighborhood driveways now funneled through an opening carved directly across my eastern acreage. Decorative stone columns framed the entrance, complete with wrought iron lettering that read, Willow Creek Estates, East Gate. Brand new landscaping lined both sides of the pavement. Fresh sod, young maple trees, automatic irrigation. Millions of dollars in future property values now depended on a strip of land they didn't own. The realization settled over me slowly. This had never been about improving traffic. This was infrastructure, permanent infrastructure. Diane had gambled that once hundreds of families depended on this entrance, no judge would ever order it removed. She believed she had created a problem too expensive to reverse. As another SUV rolled confidently through my property without slowing down, I noticed something else. Every single vehicle entering the eastern half of Willow Creek Estates passed through one narrow corridor. One entrance, one exit, one piece of land. My land. I looked back at the wall stretching across the pasture where my grandfather once taught me how to repair fences. Then I looked at the endless line of residents driving through what they believed had become their new neighborhood gateway. A quiet thought crossed my mind. If one wall could force everyone to enter, another wall could make sure nobody ever left. Most people think anger makes you reckless. In my experience as an engineer, anger only becomes dangerous when it learns to wait. I slipped my phone into my pocket after taking dozens of photographs from every angle imaginable. Every expansion joint, every footing, every decorative stone column, every tire track crossing my pasture. If someone had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building permanent structures on my land, I wanted a record that would outlive every excuse they were about to invent. Diane watched me quietly from 20 yards away, whispering something to one of the board members before climbing back into her SUV. She wasn't nervous. She looked relieved. That bothered me more than the wall itself. Confident people usually know something you don't. Emily walked beside me as we made our way back toward the house. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking they expected me to scream. And I'm not going to give them what they rehearsed for." Inside the farmhouse, everything still smelled faintly of cedar and old leather. The framed photographs on the mantel hadn't changed. My grandfather smiling beside his cattle. My father holding me on his shoulders near the eastern fence line. Looking at those pictures settled something inside me. This wasn't just property. It was history measured in generations instead of dollars. I climbed the narrow staircase to the study where my grandfather kept decades of survey maps, tax records, and engineering drawings inside weathered filing cabinets. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight as I pulled open drawer after drawer. Deeds, utility easements, fence maintenance receipts, old aerial photographs. Everything had been labeled in his neat handwriting. Downstairs, I heard someone knocking firmly on the front door. Emily answered before I reached the hallway. "Mr. Calloway?" a man's voice called. "Certified delivery." I accepted the thick envelope from the courier and immediately recognized the gold Willow Creek Estates logo embossed across the top. Inside was a professionally printed packet nearly 40 pages thick. Community Access Enhancement Project. Traffic Improvement Initiative. Neighborhood Connectivity Expansion. Every page was written with polished legal language designed to make theft sound like civic responsibility. Near the back sat an invoice. Amount due, $48,730. My contribution toward the construction completed on my property. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because the arrogance was almost impressive. They had trespassed, poured concrete across my land, and then billed me for the privilege. Emily read over my shoulder before looking at me in disbelief. They cannot be serious. I flipped to the signature page. Diane Whitlock, HOA president. 3 additional board signatures followed beneath hers. Every one of them had approved the project in writing. No anonymous decisions. No hidden responsibility. They had signed their names with complete confidence. Half an hour later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a local number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Calloway?" "Speaking. This is Robert Haynes with Haynes and Cooper Law. I represent Willow Creek Estates." His tone carried the practiced politeness of someone billing by the hour. "I'm calling to encourage a cooperative resolution." Interesting choice of words. The community has already invested substantial resources into the eastern entrance. Removing it would create unnecessary hardship for hundreds of homeowners. There it was. Not an apology. Not a question. A carefully packaged appeal to guilt. "So your clients built first and planned to negotiate later?" Silence stretched across the line for several seconds. Finally, he replied, "We're hoping you'll consider granting a permanent easement. Naturally, fair compensation can be discussed." I stared through the study window toward the concrete wall cutting across my family's pasture. They weren't offering to fix what they had done. They were trying to buy forgiveness after finishing the construction. That single phone call told me everything I needed to know. The wall wasn't their mistake. It was their strategy. The easiest way to hide a lie is to bury it under enough paperwork that nobody wants to read it. The next morning, I drove straight to the county planning office before the sun had burned away the thin layer of fog hanging over the fields. The courthouse smelled exactly as it had when my father used to bring me there to file. Agricultural permits, old paper, polished wood, and stale coffee. Some places never really change. I wish the same could be said for people. I met with a zoning clerk named Melissa, a woman who looked like she'd spent 20 years correcting mistakes made by people who thought rules were optional. I slid the HOA packet across her desk along with copies of my deed and the photographs I'd taken the day before. She adjusted her glasses, studying each page in silence. The only sound was the steady tapping of her keyboard and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, she frowned. "These permits reference a community improvement project," she said. "But," she clicked through another screen, "I'm not seeing an approved land transfer." My pulse remained steady. Can someone legally build permanent structures on private property without one? She looked up. "Not unless they own the property or have recorded easement rights." "Can you verify whether they do?" Her fingers moved across the keyboard again. 30 seconds later, she shook her head. "Nothing has been recorded against your parcel." That answer should have made me feel victorious. Instead, it made the situation even stranger. Someone had approved construction worth hundreds of thousands of dollars without securing the legal rights first. Either they were unbelievably reckless, or they believed they would never be challenged. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every permit connected to Willow Creek Estates over the past 2 years. Melissa promised they would be ready within 48 hours. As I walked toward the parking lot, my phone vibrated. Unknown number again. "Mr. Calloway," the familiar attorney said. "I'm hoping you've had time to reconsider. I just left the county office." Silence. "Interesting. They can't find any easement allowing your clients to build on my land." Another pause. This one lasted longer. Paperwork can occasionally lag behind active development. I couldn't help smiling. Concrete dries faster than legal documents. His voice became noticeably tighter. I'm simply suggesting patience. I've been patient. I ended the call before he could continue. On my drive home, I passed the Eastern entrance again. It was busier than ever. School buses, delivery vans, landscapers, residents jogging along the brand-new sidewalks as though the entrance had always belonged there. Nobody questioned it. Human beings adapt surprisingly fast when convenience replaces curiosity. At home, Emily was standing on the porch with our elderly neighbor, Walter Briggs. Walter had lived across the road for nearly 40 years and had watched Willow Creek estates rise from open pasture into rows of identical houses. He leaned on his cane, removing his weathered cap as I approached. "Figured you'd be back from the county," he said quietly. "I should have called you while you were gone." "You knew?" His shoulders sagged. "I watched every truck come through." "Then why didn't you stop them?" He looked genuinely ashamed. "They showed me maps. Said the county approved everything." Diane kept saying the Callaways had finally agreed to donate the strip for community access. Donate. The word hit harder than I expected. My grandfather had refused million-dollar offers for that exact section of land because he believed ownership wasn't something you surrendered for applause. Walter reached into his pickup and handed me a folded envelope. One of the surveyors dropped this the first day they started digging. Didn't think much of it until yesterday. Inside was a photocopy of a construction staging map. Across the top corner, someone had written 3 words in thick black marker: "Complete before return." I stared at the note for several seconds while the afternoon wind rustled the oak leaves overhead. They hadn't simply taken advantage of my honeymoon. They had scheduled the entire operation around it. The moment you realize someone planned against you, the fight stops being about what they did. It becomes about understanding why they were so confident they would get away with it. I spent that night sitting alone in my grandfather's study, the construction maps spread across the wooden desk beneath the yellow glow of an old lamp. The paper smelled like dust and ink, but the words written across it felt colder than anything outside. Complete. Before return. 3 simple words. 3 words that proved Diane Whitlock never intended to ask for permission. She intended to create a problem so large that everyone would eventually surrender. The next morning, I met with my attorney, Daniel Mercer, a property rights specialist who had handled complicated land disputes across the state. His office smelled like coffee and printer paper, the kind of place where thousands of battles had been fought using nothing but documents and patience. He examined every photograph, every permit, and every page from the HOA packet. For almost an hour, he said nothing. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Ethan, you have a strong case." I waited for the rest. Lawyers always have a second sentence. The sentence that tells you how expensive the first one will become. "But," I asked. He sighed. "But they built something expensive. Judges don't like undoing major projects after people start depending on them." There it was. The exact strategy Diane was counting on. The wall wasn't just concrete. It was pressure. Every family using that entrance became a reason for someone to hesitate. Every dollar spent became an argument for compromise. "So they can build on my land and force me to negotiate afterward?" I asked. Daniel looked at the documents again. "That's what they're hoping." That afternoon, Diane called an emergency neighborhood meeting. Of course she did. By the time Emily and I arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was packed. The smell of grilled food and fresh landscaping filled the warm evening air. It looked less like a legal dispute and more like a celebration. A giant banner hung behind the stage. Willow Creek Estates East Entrance Grand Opening. Diane stood beneath it wearing a bright smile while residents applauded. She wasn't acting like someone accused of trespassing. She was acting like someone receiving an award. "This project represents progress," she announced. "A safer, more connected community." The crowd clapped. I watched my own land become a backdrop for her victory speech. Then she noticed me standing near the back. Her smile widened. "Ethan, I'm glad you came. I was hoping we could finally move forward together." She handed me a microphone before I could refuse. The entire room went quiet. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me. For a second, I understood her move. She wanted emotion. She wanted anger. She wanted me to look unreasonable in front of everyone. I slowly lifted the microphone. "I have one question," I said. Diane crossed her arms confidently. "Did anyone here see a signed agreement allowing HOA construction on my property?" Silence. Real silence. The kind where people suddenly realize they might not know the full story. A few residents looked at each other. Diane stepped forward. "We have approvals." "From whom?" I asked. Her expression changed for half a second. Barely noticeable, but I saw it. "The board approved it." "The board doesn't own my land." The room became uncomfortable. The applause disappeared. Diane quickly took back the microphone. "This is exactly why personal emotions cannot interfere with community decisions." I almost smiled. She still thought this was about emotions. She didn't understand yet. I wasn't trying to convince the neighborhood. I was building a record. Every statement, every admission, every confident mistake. By the time I left that meeting, I knew something important. Diane believed the wall protected her. She didn't realize it had already become the biggest piece of evidence against her. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. Sometimes it's sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting for the right person to open the drawer. 3 days after the HOA meeting, I received a call from Melissa at the county planning office. Her voice sounded different this time. Less routine, more careful. "Mr. Calloway, you should come in when you have a chance. I found something unusual." I arrived before lunch, carrying the same leather folder my grandfather had used for decades. The courthouse was quieter than usual that morning. The hallway lights hummed above me, and the smell of old documents filled the air as Melissa guided me into the records room. She placed a stack of papers on the table. "These are the original subdivision filings for Willow Creek Estates." I looked at the maps spread across the surface. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Streets, lots, common areas. Nothing that explained why Diane thought she could build on my property. Then Melissa pointed to the eastern boundary. "Look here." I leaned closer. There it was. A narrow strip of land marked separately from the subdivision. My land. The exact corridor where the HOA built their entrance. But underneath that marking was something even more important. A handwritten notation from the original surveyor. "Private access reserved to Calloway parcel. No permanent structures permitted." I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the paper. My grandfather wasn't just protecting the land. He had protected it from exactly this situation. "This was recorded in 1984, Melissa explained. "Every future property document should have referenced it." "Should have?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Someone removed it from the HOA copies." That sentence changed everything. A mistake was one thing. A mistake could be fixed. But removing a restriction from documents was something completely different. I photographed every page and requested certified copies immediately. When I left the courthouse, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt focused. The difference mattered. Anger makes you react. Focus makes you move. That evening, Daniel Mercer reviewed the documents at my kitchen table while rain tapped against the windows. The smell of Emily's coffee filled the room as we studied the original filings. After 20 minutes, Daniel looked up. "They thought they had a permanent solution. Because everyone was already using the road?" I asked. He nodded. "Exactly. They wanted dependency before anyone challenged them." He tapped the map with his finger. "But this changes everything." "How?" "Because you don't need to prove the wall is inconvenient. You only need to prove it was never legally allowed to exist." For the first time since returning from our honeymoon, I felt like I had solid ground beneath my feet again. But Daniel wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. "There is one problem." I looked at him. "What problem?" He placed a newspaper article on the table. The headline was from 6 months earlier. "Willow Creek Estates announces $4 million expansion project." Below it was a photograph of Diane Whitlock smiling beside the same wall, now standing on my property. "They promoted this project publicly," Daniel said. "They attached their reputation to it." I studied Diane's face in the photograph. The perfect smile. The confident posture. The woman who believed she had built something untouchable. Then Daniel pointed to a small paragraph near the bottom of the article. The HOA had received a community development loan based on the value of the new entrance and access improvements. They had borrowed money against something they didn't own. Suddenly, the wall wasn't just a property violation. It was a financial liability. Every dollar they spent made their mistake larger. Every resident who depended on that entrance made their position weaker. I looked out the window toward the dark outline of the eastern field. Diane had built a wall because she thought concrete created power. She didn't understand something my grandfather taught me long ago. Real ownership isn't about what you build on land. It's about what the law says belongs to you. The biggest mistake people make when they think they have won is they stop preparing for the moment they lose. Diane Whitlock had built her entire strategy around one assumption. I would fight the wall, not understand it. She expected anger. She expected complaints. She expected me to spend months arguing while the neighborhood slowly accepted her version of reality. What she didn't expect was patience. The following week, I stopped talking about removing the wall. I stopped answering Diane's carefully worded emails. I stopped explaining myself to neighbors who had already chosen sides. Instead, I started building something much more important. A legal record. Every morning, I walked the property line with my camera. The cold metal survey markers pressed against my fingertips as I checked every measurement. The smell of fresh concrete was still hanging around the eastern entrance, but now I noticed something different. The wall wasn't a symbol of their power anymore. It was evidence. Daniel filed a formal notice with the county demanding an investigation into unauthorized construction on private property. At the same time, we submitted copies of the original subdivision documents, the removed easement restriction, and photographs showing the timeline of construction. Diane responded within hours. Her email arrived with the same polished confidence she had shown from the beginning. She accused me of trying to harm the community. She claimed I was threatening hundreds of families by challenging an essential access road. She even attached a petition signed by over 100 residents asking me to consider the greater good. I read the entire document sitting at my kitchen table. Emily watched my expression carefully. "Does that bother you?" she asked. I looked at the signatures. No. Why not? Because none of these people own the land they're asking me to sacrifice. That was the difference Diane never understood. She had turned the issue into a popularity contest because she couldn't win a property argument. 2 days later, county inspectors arrived at Willow Creek Estates. I watched from my porch as they walked along the wall with clipboards in their hands. The same residents who had cheered during Diane's grand opening now stood outside watching silently. The mood had changed. The excitement was gone. No cameras. No speeches. No applause. Just people realizing they might have trusted the wrong person. That evening, Diane called me directly. "Ethan, we need to talk." Her voice was different. The confidence was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. "About what?" I asked, finding a reasonable solution. I almost laughed. A week earlier, she called it progress. Now it was a solution. "You mean the permanent easement you wanted me to sign?" "I'm trying to protect homeowners." "No, you're trying to protect a mistake." Silence filled the line. Then she lowered her voice. "You understand what happens if this entrance is closed, right? Emergency access. Property values. Hundreds of families affected." I looked through the window toward the wall standing across my grandfather's field. "Diane, those consequences existed the moment you built something. Without permission." She didn't answer. Because for the first time, the problem wasn't mine to solve. The next morning, Daniel brought me an updated survey map. He placed it on the table and pointed toward the eastern boundary. "There is something interesting here." I leaned closer. "The original documents don't just protect your land. What else do they do?" He smiled slightly. "They define access rights." I studied the map. The HOA entrance wasn't just built on my property. Their entire eastern traffic system depended on a narrow corridor that had always remained private. Daniel tapped the paper again. "If you wanted to build a barrier on your own land, following county code, nobody could stop you." I looked back toward the wall outside. For the first time, I understood the irony. Diane had created the exact weakness she thought would protect her. She built one wall to control my property. Now the law had given me the right to build another one. People think revenge is about making someone suffer. They picture anger, shouting, and destruction. But the most satisfying victories are often quiet. They happen with permits, signatures, and a simple piece of paper that changes everything. I spent the next week doing exactly what Diane had done from the beginning. I followed the rules. Every measurement was checked. Every document was reviewed. Every permit was approved. The difference was simple. I actually owned the land. Daniel helped me submit the plans for a boundary wall along the eastern section of my property. It wasn't a giant structure. It wasn't designed to intimidate anyone. It was a legal fence built exactly where the original survey allowed. The same land Diane had used for her entrance. The same land her HOA claimed was now a community asset. The county reviewed everything carefully. Height restrictions, setback requirements, property boundaries, drainage regulations. Nothing was skipped. Nothing was rushed. 3 weeks later, the approval letter arrived. I remember holding that envelope in my hands while standing in the kitchen. The morning sunlight reflected off the paper, and for the first time since returning from our honeymoon, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own property again. Emily looked at the approval and smiled. So you're actually doing this? I folded the letter carefully. I'm not doing anything they wouldn't allow me to do. That was the part Diane couldn't understand. She believed rules were weapons she controlled. She never imagined those same rules could protect someone else. Construction started early Monday morning. The sound of heavy equipment rolling onto my property echoed across the fields. Diesel fumes mixed with the smell of fresh earth as workers marked the boundary lines. Within hours, neighbors started noticing. Vehicles slowed down near the eastern entrance. People stepped out of their cars to watch. The same residents who had celebrated Diane's wall now looked confused. One homeowner approached me while I was reviewing the construction plans. "Are you really closing the entrance?" he asked. I looked at the wall behind him. "I'm building on my property." He hesitated. "But everyone uses that road. That was a choice your HOA made before asking permission." He didn't have an answer for that. By the end of the week, the new structure was taking shape. Concrete blocks, steel reinforcement, a solid foundation. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just a boundary. Diane arrived on the fourth day, driving faster than usual. Her SUV stopped near the construction site, and she stepped out before the engine had even cooled. The confident smile was gone. "Ethan, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I handed her the county approval documents. She barely looked at them. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. "Because everything has been approved." She stared at the papers, searching for something to challenge. "You can't just block community access." I looked at her calmly. "Interesting. That's exactly what you did." Her expression tightened. "This is different." "Why?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because there was no difference. Only one person had permission. One person had followed the law. One person had built on land they actually owned. The following morning, the final section of the wall was installed. The last piece of concrete settled into place with a heavy thud that echoed across the field. I stood there watching the workers pack up their equipment while the afternoon wind moved through the oak trees. Diane's wall still stood on my land, but now it had become something else. A reminder. She built a barrier because she thought she had power. I built one because the law said I could. The most powerful moment in any fight is not when your opponent falls. It's when they finally understand they were never in control. For Diane Whitlock, that moment came on a cold Monday morning when the county inspector returned to Willow Creek Estates with a stack of documents and a very different expression from the one he had worn weeks earlier. I watched from my porch as residents gathered near the eastern entrance. The same entrance they once celebrated. The same wall they once photographed. The same project Diane called a victory. Now everyone stood quietly, waiting to hear what happened next. The inspector reviewed the findings in front of the HOA board. Unauthorized construction. Improper land use. Missing property rights documentation. Every phrase landed heavier than the last. Diane tried to interrupt several times. This was approved by the community. The inspector didn't even look up. A community vote does not transfer private ownership. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. For months, Diane had convinced people that enough signatures could replace a deed. That enough confidence could replace permission. But property lines don't care about popularity. The law doesn't change because someone built something expensive. Over the next several weeks, everything Diane had built around herself started falling apart. The HOA's lender questioned the access improvements attached to the development loan. Residents demanded answers about why they were never told the entrance crossed private property. Some homeowners who had defended Diane became the loudest voices asking for her resignation. The same people who applauded her speeches now wanted to know why she had risked their money and their neighborhood. Diane eventually agreed to a settlement meeting. I sat across from her in a conference room at Daniel's law office. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and stacks of legal documents covered the table between us. For the first time since I met her, Diane looked tired. Not angry, not confident, just tired. "You could have worked with us," she said quietly. I looked at the documents in front of me. "I tried." She shook her head. "You wanted to fight." I almost smiled. "No, Diane. I wanted you to stop." She looked away. Because deep down, she knew the truth. The conflict never started because I refused to cooperate. It started because she believed cooperation meant surrender. The final agreement required the HOA to remove the illegal portions of the entrance structure and compensate me for damages to my property. The wall they built came down piece by piece. The sound of demolition echoed across the field where the first wall had once stood. Concrete breaking, machinery moving, dust rising into the morning sunlight. I stood beside Emily watching it disappear. It was strange. The wall that had caused so much anger looked surprisingly small while being destroyed. That was the thing about false power. It always looks bigger before the truth arrives. Months later, I walked the eastern boundary again. The grass had started growing back around the old construction area. The oak trees my grandfather planted still stood exactly where they always had. The land remembered. It always does. Emily and I eventually finished our honeymoon trip that had been interrupted by Diane's decision. But when we came home, something had changed. Not the property, not the house, me. I learned that protecting what belongs to you doesn't always require making noise. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires documents, discipline, and the willingness to stand alone when everyone else believes a lie. Diane built a wall thinking it would prove she had control. Instead, it proved she never understood ownership at all. Because real power doesn't come from taking someone else's land. It comes from knowing exactly what is yours.